Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 2022 Keep It Clean Pre-Harvest Tips and Tools webinar. Thanks for being here with us today. My name is Jeff English. I'm the Vice President of Marketing and Communications here at Pulse Canada, based out of Winnipeg. Now, as you all know, the success of Canadian agriculture depends on steady and predictable market access to major international markets. Crop protection, product application, and the decisions made are an important part of that, and that's why we're here today. The 2022 Pre-Harvest Glyphosate Staging Guide and our product advisory are just a few of the Keep It Clean initiatives tools that help guide growers and agronomists. So today we're going to hear from three different speakers who are going to be covering timely information about which crop protection products may create market risk in 2022, as well as some more information on pre-harvest tips and tools. So with us today are Greg Bartley, Director of Crop Protection and Crop Quality at Pulse Canada, Krista Zuzak, Director of Crop Protection and Production for Cereals Canada, and Ian F., an agronomy specialist at the Canola Council of Canada. I want to thank all of our panelists for being here today. I want to thank you on the line for being here today, and I'm going to turn it over to Greg Bartley to get it going on an overview of what Keep It Clean does for the industry. Greg?
Perfect. Thanks, Jeff. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to Keep It Clean pre-harvest webinar. I hope the growing season going well for everyone, and we're getting close to harvesting some great crops this year. We'll just jump right into it, and then we'll go into the next slide. So to start off, I'm sure everyone's aware of this, but it sets a good context and reminder that Canadian agriculture is export dependent. Canada's crop production far exceeds our domestic demand for food, and the continued success of Canadian agriculture is reliant on our ability to export. So that's why it's so important for the discussion today to make sure that we're able to continue exporting our crops and not run into any trade problems. So to give you an example of what we export or the percentage that we export, if you look at our canola crops, over 90% of canola is exported to over more than 50 countries. Over 80% of our wheat is exported to more than 70 countries. And over 85% of our pulse crops are exported to more than 130 different countries. So just gives you a picture of how much we're exporting in terms of our crop production, but also the vast majority or the number of markets that we export to and what we have to pay attention to make sure we're not causing trade disruptions. Next slide. So agriculture exports must meet the standards set by our importing countries. This is extremely important. So I just want to highlight here an article that was actually in the Western Producer a couple of weeks ago. It was titled "Slow Death by 1,000 Regulations." That it's the perfect setup to discuss right today in terms of setting up the context. When we look at our exporting countries, countries have the right to set standards, the rules and regulations to protect human health, plant, animal, or environmental health. That's their right. However, to set those standards, they must be based on science-based regulations, but also must not cause unnecessary trade concerns due to the WTO trade obligations. So when we talk about sanitary and phytosanitary non-tariff measures in our export markets, the things that we're really considering, or the vast majority that we consider, is there's things like crop protections and product residues. So this is where our MRLs, or maximum residue limits, come in, but also includes plant health, so plant disease or weed seeds or insects in our stored grain. All these can potentially be non-tariff trade barriers in our export markets. Other considerations are crop genetics, so GMOs. There might be non-approved crop genetics or export markets, and that's something we have to pay attention to when we grow those crops here in Canada, but obviously when we export those into export markets. So unfortunately, and what this article really gets at is we're seeing the erosion of the science-based approach to SPS measures in our exporting countries. It is really unfortunate, and it causes a lot of unnecessary trade concerns. So I think when we think about this, and one of the main drivers that's really eroding the science-based approach is when we look at the European Union. The European Union Farm to Fork strategy highlights high target goals, especially related to crop protection products, to reduce their pesticide use. And unfortunately, what we're seeing with the EU now as well is new regulations coming into place, such as a policy that they call the Mirror Clause policy. So this type of policy is trying to implement the EU standards on imported crops in the EU. So essentially applying the standards for the EU to other countries and how they grow their crops. And this isn't good. We know that the EU agriculture is different here in Canada or other countries compared to how it's grown in the EU, and we must take that into account. So this is what we're seeing. This article does a great job of outlining, how little bits and pieces can eat away at this, and how it can cause unnecessary trade concerns in the long run. Next slide. So what are we doing? We know this is a problem. We understand that SPS measures are in place in export countries, and countries have the right to set regulations and standards. But what is us as industry, Pulse Canada, Cereals Canada, Canola Council Canada, doing to stay ahead of this and make sure that there are no unnecessary trade disruptions, so we continue exporting our crops to these export markets? We can split this down into a bit of a proactive and reactive approach. So in a reactive fashion, this is where we monitor policy and regulations, export markets, and we react to any trade barriers that might pop up. So this is where we can work with CFIA if there's a technical barrier that we can provide evidence to support that, address an export market's concerns, and work to fix that to make sure that we can continue exporting grain or meet the demands of that country. A more of a proactive approach, and this is where we like to put a lot of effort in to make sure that these unnecessary trade barriers happen, is really to advocate for and maintain a science-based approach to policy and regulation in export markets. So avenues that we can do this, working with the government of Canada, is through free trade agreements, making sure that these measures are addressed in any new free trade agreements to make sure that they don't cause barriers. We can work with the World Trade Organization. So during these SPS meetings, the government of Canada can have bilateral meetings with other countries that we may cause concerns, and address these concerns during those meetings. Or we can advocate for the utilization of international standards. So, this is a good example when we talk about MRLs, or maximum residue limits, to use a Codex MRLs, where if an MRL is missing in an export market or might be different, there's an international standard in place that can be used, and this should be used more often. And finally, the last thing that we do, and by no means this is all of it, but we can provide information to growers, agronomists, and exporters just to help manage the short-term risk of an MRL non-compliance. So this is an example where if we know there's a risk in export market, taking that short-term approach just to communicate that. So if there's a practice that can be done on farm, or certain production practices that would alleviate that risk in the short term, we want to make sure that we can communicate that and do all we can to make sure that doesn't cause a concern. And obviously, I'm talking about the Keep It Clean program. So the Keep It Clean program is a joint initiative of the Canola Council of Canada, Cereals Canada, Pulse Canada, and the Prairie Oak Growers Association that provides growers and crop advisors with resources for growing market-ready crops. So this includes things like timely updates on potential market risks and resources for on-farm practices, just to ensure that the crops meet the standards of those domestic and export customers. So making sure that, if there is a standard in export market that does cause that concern, we can communicate that through the Keep It Clean program, just to make sure that we continue exporting our crops and don't cause unnecessary trade disruptions. So from here, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, Ian Epp at the Canola Council, to walk you through the 5 simple tips of the Keep It Clean program.
Thanks, Greg. So these 5 simple tips, these are how we've distilled all of the, the various things that Greg was talking about. So SPS, various export markets, demands. How do we bring this into a grower focus? Or what do you in industry need to understand? Or what are we trying to communicate? So we have 5 simple tips that kind of distill the Keep It Clean program. So tip number 1, using acceptable pesticides only. So these are pesticides that are registered on your crop in Canada. Now the part of that means you can legally apply the pesticide, which is key. That also means that various organizations, we've done the work to take those pesticides that are registered in Canada, and we've looked at the global export markets and made sure that when you're applying them, if you're applying them as they're registered in Canada, they're going to be good to use unless they appear in the Keep It Clean program. And the vast majority of products are good to go. But again, they have to be registered in Canada. If you're using a product that's not registered here, we probably haven't looked at it. From an export standpoint, there likely isn't going to be an MRL in place. And then we'll have not only issues on the production side, but also we're going to have MRL issues. We're going to have problems with our global export markets. So pesticides have to be registered in Canada. That means we've done look to kind of scrutinize them, make sure they fit in, those 50 to 130 export markets that you heard about on the previous slides. And if you do have any questions, talking to your grain buyer is always a good idea. Next slide. Tip number 2, read and follow the label. This is probably the single most valuable tip, especially this time of year for everyone in industry. We have a wide variety of pesticides that are available to be used on all the crops, and that's excellent. We need these tools for various pests, disease, insects. But we make sure they're registered in Canada. We got to make sure we're applying them correctly. So the right rate, sometimes there's a variety rate, sometimes it's very specific what rate needs to be applied. We quite often think of rate on the agronomic side as far as I need to make sure I'm controlling this weed at this size, etc. But also exceeding that rate can cause us issues with the residue, the timing. Again, this time of year, probably one of the more important ones, making sure we're applying at the actual recommended crop stage, especially as we get into later seasons. We want to make sure we're applying them correctly. They're registered correctly, again, on the agronomic side to control a window and, weeds, some of these things. We want to control them as soon as we can, but also we need to control them at the rate on the label. That factors into what the residue looks like. Sometimes products are metabolized or not metabolized. There's a residue that kind of declines over time. So making sure we're on the right, at the right crop stage. And the last one is the pre-harvest interval. So the number of days between when you apply a product and when you're either going to swath it or start straight cutting that crop. Now, on a lot of products, this doesn't come into effect, or this isn't a big issue, especially the early season ones. If you're applying on the right label for timing, the pre-harvest interval is clean and easy, and it's not so much of an issue. But as we get later in the season, especially the pre-harvest intervals, you'll hear more about glyphosate coming up, as well as late season insecticides, especially maybe this year with maybe a bit more grasshoppers in some parts of the country. We want to make sure that whatever insecticide we're using, whatever product we're using, you're on the pre-harvest interval. So you might have 3 or 4 products that control an insect, but they have very different pre-harvest intervals. So as you're only 10 days from harvest, you might only have 1 or 2 options, or there's one option that may, apply now because it's got a 21-day, but so these are just something to consider. And the spray to swath calculator does this for you. Type in the product you're looking for, it'll tell you how many days you have. So a really handy tool, especially as we get late in the season. Next slide. Managing your disease pressure. Disease can also be a market access issue. And again, something that, we don't want to have issues on the market access side, but also agronomically, we really want to be controlling them anyway, right? To get top yields. So disease resistant varieties when available, good crop rotation, clean seed, and I think maybe integrated pest approach. The most important thing maybe this time of year is assessing what kind of disease do I have in my field, and what do I have to change for next year? Do I have disease in my field? Do I have issues this year? And what does that mean for next year? Do I need to lengthen out a rotation on a specific crop? Is there a certain disease that I'm not getting great control, or it's always there? It seems to be creeping up on me. I think Blackleg could be an example in canola where there's always a little bit of Blackleg around, but if you see a trend of higher Blackleg in some of your canola crops, maybe it's time to do something different, whether it's rotating crop varieties, lengthening your rotation, the seed treatment, those kind of things. Next slide. Tip number 4 is store your crop correctly. Clean bins are key, and using the right bin treatments, especially in the canola world, not using malathion to prepare a bin. And this is sometimes tough. We go through in the middle of summer, we clean all our bins. Maybe we had some issues from last year's crop. We spray some bins just to make sure they're nice and clean. And we don't necessarily know what crop is going to go into what specific bin. But if we are using any sort of malathion, there can't be a bin that canola goes in. Just a small reminder, one that sneaks through the cracks every once in a while for some growers. Next slide. And then the last one is deliver what you declare. So that declaration of eligibility is a legally binding document. You really want to make sure we have the right information on there. Things can be traced back to the farm. Individuals could be held liable, but really, I think from a grower perspective, most of this is good record keeping is key throughout the growing season as a grower. When you applied pesticides, what you applied, when you applied it. Those are good records to have anyway when you want to go back and make decisions for next year, good decisions on the farm. But those are really helpful things to have when you go to sell your grain and you're signing this up to, what products did I use? How did I use them? Did I use them correctly? And again, reach out to your grain buyer. They're very happy to answer questions on parts of this or walk you through the process. Next slide. I think I'm going to hand it over to Krista now.
Thanks so much, Ian. Good morning. My name is Krista Zuzak from Cereals Canada, and I'm going to introduce to you some of the tools and resources that we have as part of our Keep It Clean website. So under keepitclean.ca for tools and resources, sometimes we refer to this as our digital toolkit. What you'll find there is our pre-harvest glyphosate staging guide, which I'll talk a little bit more about. the list of product advisories that we've also had a previous webinar on, our spray to swath interval calculator that we'll talk more about today, as well as webinars, shareable graphic and content, and our news and updates are all posted to the website. Next slide, please. Thank you. So from here, when we talk about our pre-harvest glyphosate staging guide, again, this is located on keepitclean.ca under our tools. And what we really want to think about is Keep It Clean aim to produce this staging guide because glyphosate or pre-harvest glyphosate is such a critical tool for farmers that we really need out there to protect market access and to keep crops being market ready. So as part of the 2022 season, we do have our pre-harvest glyphosate staging guide, and we also have videos that are posted on the website, and they include information for canola, cereal, and pulse crops. What we really want to emphasize from our pre-harvest glyphosate staging guide is to follow the label. So as part of one of the tips that Ian just talked about, we really want to be thinking about following the label, only applying pre-harvest glyphosate for weed control, and keeping in mind that timing. So once grain moisture is less than 30% in the least mature part of the field. Something to also be mindful of is regrowth and late tillering. So especially last year when we had a drought, for example, we saw a lot of fields that were in dry conditions and maybe had some late season moisture, and producing those secondary tillers or late growth, this can start to impact your grain moisture assessment. So that now becomes the least mature part of your field. And if you're near seed or grain production on that crop, and you would be applying pre-harvest glyphosate to those to control weeds, you would also potentially see an increased risk of residues happening on there. And when we really think about, when we think about kind of uneven maturity concerns as well, this is something that we think about kind of that threshold for glyphosate application, and why the 30% moisture is so important is also keeping in mind that we want it to be at less than 30% moisture because glyphosate is not to be used as a desiccant. So keeping in mind that glyphosate is to be used as that tool for pre-harvest weed control, and then reminding you that off-label use is illegal and can have serious consequences as well as for market access. Next slide, please. So thinking about our next tool, we have our product advisory as one of our available resources. So we really want to keep you aware of those pre-harvest, of the market access risks that are associated with crops. So we have our product advisory for 2022. These are updated on an annual basis, as well as if any changes are made to give growers the most up-to-date information. And what we want to look for here is pre-harvest products, but products in general, as Ian mentioned, maybe some of those later season insecticides. And we want to review these before we're making applications on our product decisions each year. And we want to keep markets open for all. So this provides some information by crop as well as by crop type, where we should be not using a product, where we should be talking to our grain buyer, or where there is not a market risk. Next slide, please. And from here, we also have our tool that's the spray to swath interval calculator. So what this works on is growers can use this tool to find a product to fit their timeline, or to find the minimum number of days that they would need to wait to cut their crop based on the product they have chosen. So as Ian kind of alluded to, you might want to use this tool to calculate your PHI, or your pre-harvest interval. So you would enter the crop type and the product you've sprayed, and the calculator will tell you how many days after application you have to wait to harvest your crop. You can also use this tool to find a product to suit a specific timeline. So again, entering your crop type and pesticide type, and you can drag that little slider over to indicate when you would like to cut the crop. And the calculator will tell you which, if any, products can be applied to meet that timeline. And next slide. And I'll turn it back over to you, Jeff. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Krista. So now we're going to jump into a bit of crop-specific information and considerations for our pre-harvest tips and tools. So we'll go to the next slide, Jeff. So before we get started, I just want to make sure everyone's on the same page and cover what an MRL is. So MRL stands for maximum residue limit, and it represents the maximum amount of pesticide residues that are expected to remain on a food product when the pesticide is used according to label directions. So I just want to highlight that last part. It's really key, and why Ian before stressed the importance of always reading and follow the label. When these MRLs are established, it's based on the label information, and it's the most restrictive use pattern that could potentially happen. So that's how that MRL is established. So again, just want to highlight it's not a measure of food safety. That's not what the MRL is for. However, food safety is considered when establishing the MRL. MRLs are primarily used for a trade purpose. So it's just meant to make sure that the products are used according to label directions and it's been reviewed in our export markets. However, when we talk about MRLs and how MRLs are set here in Canada, when we're exporting a grain, our Canadian must meet the MRL set by the destination country in order to avoid trade disruption. So it's always the MRLs in export markets that we need to pay attention to when we're using our crop protection products, as we're so export dependent, and it's why it's such a main focus of this program. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to go over or kind of review some of our product advisory information at a high level, and just touch on the ones that are close to, obviously just before harvest or some pre-harvest considerations. So just want to highlight again that on the advisory, we do have a chlorothalonil highlighted here, and it's categorized as yellow on chickpeas. So what this means is just be informed. Talk to your buyer if you've used this product on chickpeas, just to make sure that it won't cause any trade concerns if exporting the chickpeas to the European Union. So MRLs have been invoked in the EU. There's a potential market risk here. However, it's something that we're still trying to determine what that level of risk is. We do have some data that indicates that, this shouldn't. But in order to gain more confidence in this approach, we just like to get more data. So we're going to be evaluating chickpeas again this growing season at harvest time that had chlorothalonil applied, just to make sure that our assumption, well, not assumption, but our just ensure that there aren't detectable residues, just to make sure that when we're exporting to the EU, it's not causing the trade concern. Also want to highlight here that the PMRA has proposed to cancel all outdoor uses of chlorothalonil. So Pulse Canada has provided a submission to the PMRA to support the continued registration of this active ingredient, just knowing how important this tool is to chickpea growers, and hopefully we can maintain this registration as it is a very important tool. Next slide. The next advisory item that I want to talk about is Glufosinate-Ammonium, or highlight here. So, as we're going into desiccation season, there is a registration for glufosinate on lentils in Western Canada, and we're clearly recommending to growers not to use this product on lentils. The main reason for this is we do not have MRLs established in any of our major export markets. So if you look at the bottom table, you can see that we have a MRL set at 6 parts per million here in Canada on lentils. But if you look at the major exporting countries, so Codex at international standard, there is no MRL established there. There is no MRL in the US. And for the EU and Japan, we do have an MRL established, but it's either at the level of detection, such as EU, or set at a low level in Japan. So it's going to cause trade concerns. So it's a clear recommendation. Please do not use Glufosinate-Ammonium as a desiccation on your lentils in Western Canada. However, if we look at Eastern Canada, you can see there's a bit of difference in registrations. So there is a registration for glufosinate on dry beans in Eastern Canada, and this is classified as a yellow bean form. So it's indicating that when we look at our export market, in many cases we still have many of the same MRL concerns. However, there are certain applications where glufosinate can be applied on dry beans and not cause this trade concern, such as exporting dry beans to Japan. So there is a specific use where that is needed. And if you talk to your buyer, and in many cases dry beans are under contract production, they can provide that indication when this may be acceptable and could be used on dry beans in Eastern Canada. Next slide. For pre-harvest glyphosate, just to give an update here. So if we look at the classifications of pre-harvest glyphosate, you can see that in many cases we have this yellow bean formed classification on all of our pulse crops. However, there's an MA notation that goes along with this. So what this MA notation means is we're indicating that it's a market acceptance issue. The classification, when we look at the MRLs in all of our major export markets, we can see that the MRLs are, in many cases, they're established at a higher level than what we have here in Canada. So this is a really good scenario to be in terms of MRLs in our export markets. However, we still recognize that there may be market concerns due to pre-harvest glyphosate, and this is due to that consumer scrutiny of glyphosate in the export markets or consumer preference. The other highlight I want to provide here is the difference in classification between red and green lentils. So this year we split out the classification where it's that yellow be informed for green lentils, but a green no market acceptance identified for red lentils. So the reason why we've differentiated green and red lentils in these classifications is really just highlighting kind of what we're hearing at the farm level. Our recommendation here with the yellow classification is to talk to your buyer, determine if it's acceptable or not. And what we've heard is that in many cases for red lentils, it's being deemed acceptable in many cases. So if you look at the sensitivities and how green lentils versus red lentils are exported, red lentils being a bit more shipments by bulk shipment, and a difference in export markets, we determined that that risk level just maybe isn't quite the same as green lentils, and we moved ahead with a green classification for this growing season. So even though it's a green classification, I do want to stress that market acceptance issues may still arise, and it's still good practice to make sure you're talking to your buyer. However, we just want to clarify this on the advisory in terms of classifications. Next slide. So when we look to apply pre-harvest glyphosate, last year we developed a bit of a flow chart to help guide, when are we using pre-harvest glyphosate correctly. So if we just walk through this very quickly, this is something you can do on your own to determine, how are you using pre-harvest glyphosate, and maybe when we get into concerns in terms of it being used properly or not. The first question you can ask yourself is, are you using glyphosate as a desiccant? So are you using it to try to really dry down that crop? And if the answer is yes, we're saying stop. Pre-harvest glyphosate is registered for pre-harvest weed control, and it's not to be used as a desiccant. So if you're not using it as a desiccant, the next piece you want to be asking yourself is are you applying it correctly in terms of the crop staging? So are you applying glyphosate for weed control when grain moisture content is less than 30% in the least mature part of the field? And hopefully you're answering yes to this question, and that's how glyphosate is properly applied. If you're not sure if you're at 30% moisture content, we're asking just to stop and take a pause. You could potentially be risking your crop investment. So we want to make sure that we're applying it correctly. And if you have any concerns or questions in terms of application timing, Keep It Clean does provide resources such as the glyphosate staging guide to get that timing correct. So if we go to the next slide, Jeff. So as mentioned many times here, we do have a pre-harvest glyphosate staging guide, and really this is just to bring attention to that propagation timing. So when we talk about less than 30% moisture content, this is the critical moisture content for all crops, not just pulse crops, for all crops that are on the glyphosate label. So why 30%? 30% is often considered to be that physiological maturity of the plant, and once the crop is dried down below 30%, that crop has reached physiological maturity. So glyphosate being a systemic product, if it's reached physiological maturity, we're not getting that source distinct movement of nutrients in the plant going from the plant into the seed. So if you apply glyphosate above 30%, we're still getting movement in the plant, and that's where we can see that glyphosate residue move from the plant into the seed, and we can get those unacceptable residues. So that's why 30% is kind of touted here as that critical benchmark. However, when we go to assess our product or assess our crops for that application timing, the challenge is we're usually not going out with a moisture meter to determine what that moisture level is of the grain when we're applying it. So the next best thing is providing visual characteristics to help determine when we're at that critical moisture level. So within the guide, there's information in terms of what the visual characteristics of a plant are for all of our pulse types, and I'll just refer you to that guide to look at your crop and get further information. If you don't see the information, or if you're looking for even further detailed information that was provided here, highly encourage everyone to go to the provincial grower groups. So whether it's Manitoba Pulse and Soybean Growers, Alberta Pulse Growers, or Saskatchewan Pulse Growers, the grower groups have done a very good job of developing resources to help time the proper application of pre-harvest glyphosate and determine, when a pre-harvest application is needed. So if you're looking for better information, those grower groups definitely have a lot of information that can help really refine what the correct timing can be. Next slide. Great. So I'll pass it back to Ian to give some tips on canola.
Thanks, Greg. We'll just jump right to the next slide. So looking at a couple of key products and key recommendations going to harvest on the canola front, Greg did a great job of outlining glyphosate and some of the risks associated with glyphosate. Why applying too early, you're more likely to have higher residues. Some of that glyphosate still translocates into the seeds. The similar thing applies to canola. Again, we're looking at that 30% moisture in canola, that physiological maturity. Applying at that stage or later, we don't see the glyphosate moving to seed. We don't see the MRL issues. So what that looks like in the canola world is 50 to 60% seed color change in the least mature part of the field. And I'll stress that least mature. We do have quite a bit of variability in fields. You have, for a whole pile of reasons, you plant the crop if you think it's going to be even, and then you have pairs that dry out, parts that flood out, plant stand differences that cause maturity differences. But again, we're looking at that least mature part of the field. And so in some fields where if that's a significant portion of the field, or you kind of have almost two crops, you may want to look at applying glyphosate separately, or managing those areas separately, or maybe glyphosate just isn't the right product for that field. So again, 50 or 60% seed color change. So kind of swath timing. And so what that looks like on the plant is the top is firm, firm to roll, green, firm to roll. The middle are mostly brown or some speckling, and the bottoms are completely brown or black. And then the recommended harvest is 7 to 14 days after glyphosate application. Again, glyphosate is not a desiccant. It's a pre-harvest aid. We're looking for weed control, but we're not going to be rapidly drying down. So if you're looking for trying to get the combine in there quicker, glyphosate alone is not the product to be using. The one thing on the agronomic side I would mention, with glyphosate-resistant kochia being fairly widespread, if you're looking to dry down some large kochia that maybe have escaped, or you're not sure they're in your field, applying glyphosate alone, again, might not be the product for you on the weed control front to get good dry down. But whatever your angle is, if you're applying glyphosate, we're looking at that 50 to 60% seed color change minimum. You can apply later. So if you're a little unsure, waiting an extra day or two might be the right choice as well. Next slide. Another thing is, I talked briefly about pre-harvest scouting for diseases. Blackleg is another one that's 50 to 60% seed color change is a great time. It's probably the best time to be looking for blackleg. Again, nothing we can do about blackleg this year, but something to keep in mind. The global market is somewhat sensitive to blackleg. We want to keep our blackleg levels low. Agronomically, you don't want blackleg. If you're seeing some of these, if you look at the scale on your left, if you're seeing some of these 2s, 3s, 4s, that means there was significant yield loss in your field. So again, not something we want to be looking for. We want to keep a little bit of blackleg is kind of, it's common, it happens, it's not a big deal. But as we start to creep up into these 2, 3, 4s, we see significant yield loss and significant amounts of blackleg. So, what to look for, you're going to pull at least 50 plants. You want to pull lots of plants. There can be quite a bit of variability. You want to look kind of wide variety part of the field, especially at 50, 60%. If there's a part of the field that's atypical, ripening faster, a little bit different, I would maybe focus on that, but a bit of the field. And then you can rate this on this basic scale. It's pretty straightforward, just based on how much black you're seeing in the stem. This is stem cutting. You can visit blackleg.ca if you want to look at how much yield loss you are based on your average ratings, or to get a little more detail on exactly how to cut. But again, that 50 to 60%. So as you're doing your pre-harvest glyphosate application, or as you're swathing your field, a great time to be looking for blackleg. Next slide. Part of that blackleg strategy, again, why we're looking, we can't do anything about it for this year. It's really for record keeping and making different decisions down the road. Again, because it's a creeping disease, the disease pressure is around. Do we need to change our crop rotation? A 2-year break is recommended. Gets that residue from the previous crop that's infected with blackleg, gives it time to decompose. Good scouting. Seed selection, do I need to change my variety? We do know that certain varieties have different strengths when it comes to blackleg. So is it time to switch varieties? Is it time to do a blackleg race ID so I can match up? This is the kind of blackleg I have. This variety should be effective. And then there's a few other things: seed treatments, fungicide applications. And the other thing that's really important is trying to control the volunteer canola in your non canola years. Again, those can be hosts for blackleg, and they're doing you no good. They're just weeds. Next slide. And the last one, I talked briefly about malathion. Any bin that's treated with malathion, we can't have in canola. So again, just quick record keeping as we approach harvest here. If you have treated some bins with malathion, make sure there's no canola going into them. Or if you do have to treat some bins yet, maybe don't use malathion. Next slide. All right, I will turn it over to Krista.
Thanks, Ian. So I'm going to give the update on cereals for the 2022 pre-harvest information. Next slide, please. So what we're looking at here is in cereals, we really want to ensure that proper staging to avoid residue issues. And again, that 30% or less grain moisture lets you know that a pre-harvest application of glyphosate is safe to apply in most cereal crops, but we really need to keep those advisories in mind. So the recommended time to harvest after a glyphosate application is 7 to 14 days from the label, depending on those environmental conditions, but also keeping in mind that wheat, barley, and oats may not be accepted if treated with pre-harvest glyphosate. So it's very important to check with your grain buyer before applying. And we also have a red advisory on pre-harvest glyphosate for malt barley. And this is because it will not be accepted if it's sprayed with pre-harvest glyphosate. Next slide, please. And there are other resources online for the other cereal crop types that still require that less than 30% grain moisture in the least mature part of the field. And these can be found on the Keep It Clean website. Next slide. And just to kind of quickly talk through the field assessment for 30% moisture in wheat. Again, when you're assessing that field, you want to go to the least mature area. This is where residues are most likely to occur. So it's important to stage based off this location and not just think about the field average. What you want to do is look at the stem just below the head, and we really want it to have lost all of its green color. And once this occurs, we're at that physiological maturity that Greg was talking about. So you can see in the top image, the stem just below the head is still quite green. The middle plant is clearing some of the green, but isn't quite ready yet. And the third head has cleared the green and is at physiological maturity. The next part you want to do is hand thresh out or shell out the wheat head and have those kernels ready to apply pressure to. You want to use your thumbnail and apply that pressure. If the indent doesn't spring back and it remains, then the kernels are at that hard dough stage. And this is a good indication of less than 30% moisture. And also keeping in mind, if you want more information on this pre-harvest glyphosate staging in cereals, there is a video on the Keep It Clean website. Next slide, please. And we'll just briefly go through the product advisories that we have for 2022, because I do want to leave some time for questions on this webinar. And also keep in mind, there is a previously recorded webinar that goes into detail on the products on advisory for 2022. So we've Chlormequat or manipulator. So this one is acceptable on oats and wheat, but not necessarily barley. So for malt and feed, they are a B informed or an amber classification, which means you want to confirm your contract obligations with your grain buyer before you use the product. Next slide, please. So pre-harvest glyphosate, I think we've talked enough about this one, so I'll just hit the high points. Really, it's not registered as a desiccant on cereals. It is for pre-harvest weed control only, and it is so important to follow the label on this one. This one has a classification of be informed across the board for oats, wheat, and barley, so it's important to talk to your grain buyer. However, malt barley is distinct, is it has a do not use, as it will not be accepted. And Greg talked a little bit about market acceptance before. So pre-harvest glyphosate is not something that necessarily lacks or has misaligned MRLs, but it's something that causes market risk. Next slide, please. And Saflufenacil is our other product we want to talk about under advisory. So again, we really want to keep in mind following the label for timing between the application of Saflufenacil and harvest, and take those weather considerations or the weather conditions into consideration to reduce that risk. And it's not registered on oats. It is acceptable on wheat and barley. However, malt barley, like some of our other products, application using Saflufenacil will not be accepted by grain buyers. So that's an important one to remember. Next slide, please. And finally, just a quick kind of reminder recap that no matter which pre-harvest product you're applying, it's really important to read and follow the crop protection product label, including the rate, timing, and pre-harvest interval. So that concludes the cereals portion, and I'll turn it back to you, Jeff.
Well, thanks, Krista. And thanks to Krista, Greg, and Ian, of course, for all the information. We're going to go now to a brief Q&A period. I think we've got about 7 minutes left that we've allocated here. So we do have some questions that are coming in. So I'm gonna kind of float this out. Some are specific and some are a little bit more broad. So I'll probably direct it to each one of the panelists if that makes sense. So first up would be for Greg Bartley, a question about what do you recommend for pre-harvest weed control on yellow peas that is not allowed in many markets?
Yeah, for sure. So if we're talking about pre-harvest weed control, like obviously this is where glyphosate really shines, and why it's unfortunate that we can see some restrictions due to those restriction in export markets or meeting export demands. If glyphosate is not available, I'm going to say the most common product that's being used would be Diquat or Reglone in yellow peas. However, I know that it can be challenging if you have large weeds where it might not get it. Other options could be Saflufenacil or heat, and I know carbendazole is also there as well, but it's not used as much. So that Diquat's probably the best option to go forward with, but there's definitely some other products that can be considered. Just going to address a comment in our chat box here, Jeff, as well, and touching on that. So if the product doesn't appear on the product advisory, in many cases that means that there's no MRL concerns or export markets. So for example, Saflufenacil that I just touched on, there's no market concerns, and you're definitely good to go in terms of using it from an export market standpoint.
Thanks, Greg. A reminder that if you have a question as we're talking through, please put it in the Q&A, and we'll do our best to get to them all. Next one would be for Ian. How is it best to tell if canola crops are at the right stage for glyphosate? Is it necessary to check the entire field, or what's the best recommendation?
Yeah, it doesn't have to be necessarily exhaustive, but you do want to check distinct areas of the field. Generally, by the time we get to harvest, you kind of know if your field is stagey or if it's fairly uniform, but definitely checking a few spots. And if it is stagey or you have distinctive regions in the field, checking all of those, and especially following up with the least mature, those greenest areas of the field to make sure they're at that 60%. Again, we should be pretty good at familiar with this in the canola world when we're looking at green firm to roll on the tops of the canola, that speckling in the middle, and then some brown firm seeds in the bottom. But again, checking areas of your field, by then you're pretty familiar if there is any variability. And if in doubt, checking more spots is always a good choice.
Thanks, Ian. Krista, looks like this one's for you. Can cereal crops sprayed with the pre-harvest product still be used into the feed market?
Generally, yes. If it's not a product that has an advisory on it, if we're looking at wheat, we would just follow the general product advisory. Or if you're thinking about feed barley, that would be under our barley, the not malt barley category on our product advisory. So if it's something that you see a B informed or an amber on, something like pre-harvest glyphosate, you'd want to be talking to your grain buyer or your contract for feed before you're working on that.
Krista. Next one's a little bit more broad, so maybe Greg, Ian, Krista, whoever wants to take a stab at it. But in the case where there's no MRL for a product listed in a market, what's the appropriate step to be taken? Who should somebody be talking to in that instance?
Yeah, I think the nice thing we've done here as commodity associations, we've kind of done that work for you. So obviously, if there is a missing MRL in export market that we've deemed is high risk or showing a major risk, it'll show up on the product advisory. However, if there's still more concerns, or if there's if there's grain buyers that have questions about MRLs in export markets and if it's going to cause a concern or not, maybe not from a farmer standpoint, but in terms of helping our exporters out, by all means reach out to the respective commodity association, whether it's wheat, canola, pulses. We're happy to look at that MRL information and provide direction in terms of if that MRL is going to cause a concern or not. We're happy to do that.
I see nodding there. Krista, Ian, anything to add?
Greg did a nice job of summing up these product advisories. As a grower or an agronomist making recommendations, these grower advisories, when they're updated, and if there is some sort of change that happens, we update these. So this is your best source of information, or reach out to us if you have more questions on that front. And for a grower specifically, if you have some sort of either it's specialty or some sort of you're going to sign a contract or something, a good conversation with your grain buyer solves a lot of questions.
Thanks, Ian. Next, we got a couple more here, and I know we're coming to the end. Are there plans in the future to include flax advisories as part of the Keep It Clean initiative?
we've had those conversations, and I think if there's support, we can definitely there's always opportunity to include more crops, and if that information is valuable, we can work with the Flax Council of Canada to make sure that's available and see if they're willing to join the Keep It Clean program to get that information available.
And I think on that one, I would just like to add that we do have, the commodity groups have MRL assessment committees that conduct these reviews. And we are seeing more and more of the commodities monitoring MRLs and looking into more of their products. So we could see some changes there too.
Thanks, Krista. Last one, and it's maybe a big one, bigger than 1 minute allows for, but we'll do our best. Why or how come there are marketing risks present if MRLs are established in a market? Greg, Bartley, I think you touched on this a little bit earlier, but can you just break down the difference between the MRLs and what constitutes market risk?
Yeah, this is a challenging one and sometimes a tough one to swallow. When you look at the regulatory MRLs, that's one thing is that we mainly look at and based our assessments off of to make sure that there's MRLs in the export markets and that's all set in place. However, there are still potential commercial requirements. So there could be an end use buyer that requests a different spec, or there could be a situation where just the market acceptance is saying they don't want a certain practice. And at the end of the day, if a buyer wants to serve that market, there could potentially still be a restriction there. So the main focus, and I think this gets back to the start where, if we can advocate for, a science-based approach to policy setting and, utilization of international standards, this is the end goal, is to try and get everyone on the same page where if we know that there's no concerns, or if, say our regulatory body has deemed a product or practice to be safe, we'd like to see that be acceptable in our export markets and advocate for that. So that's what we do. We want to make sure that our regulations remain science-based, but at the end of the day, there could be some commercial specs that can be met, and this can be done in many cases through contract production to help meet those specialty markets.
Thanks, Greg. It's 11:51, so I think it's appropriate to wrap it to make that everything for today. I want to thank Krista, Ian, and Greg, of course, for their time, and certainly all of you on the line. We had some big numbers on today's webinar, and it's quite encouraging. I would also encourage you to sign up for the Keep It Clean email list at keepitclean.ca to stay up to date on any kind of news or updates as the program unfolds. This initiative is made possible because of the people on this line, and so we greatly appreciate your support. So thanks again for joining today, and thanks to our presenters, and take care and have a great afternoon.